All right, y'all. We'll go ahead and get started here. My name's Dan Holden. I'm the CISO at BigCommerce for the last 4.5 years. I've been in the industry now for 30 years, well over 20 of that on the vendor side, and for the last 6 or so years as a practitioner. This is a sequel to a talk I did back in 2019 talking about the CISO 2025. That got kicked off by a thread on LinkedIn. Folks were talking about, hey, what will this job look like, 5 to 6 years from now? And so that's how I got inspired and did the talk back then. And I thought, now I am a CISO in 2025, so I thought, well, let's do another talk. Jake has already poked fun at me and says he's looking forward to the talk of CISO of 2065. I might have 2 more of these in me, but 2065, I don't think so. I want to follow up on some comments that Hoff said during the opening keynote, though, regarding community and my great gratitude and enjoyment of this conference in particular. It was my first RVAsec in 2013. I was here as a vendor, and I was talking to a gentleman at TJX. And if you recall their breach, it was a long time ago, 2007. But in 2013, that was only 5 years, in the past. And so we were talking about it. And it was that conversation that actually led me towards the path of transitioning from the vendor side to the practitioner side. So the amount of influence a simple conversation can have is pretty epic. That conversation has literally led me to this spot and moment in time. What I was talking about in the first talk, of course, was what was the impact, the likelihood, things we typically talk about in security, but specifically to the CISO role and the practice of security. It's unfortunate, y'all, this CISO term gets thrown around like crazy, but it is many times, I think, synonymous with the security program in general. I actually spend a lot of time talking with marketers and salespeople, advising them not to target or sell to the CISO. It's pretty darn rare, y'all, that a CISO makes a purchasing decision. Yeah, you're the one that approves everything, and you certainly have interest in what your tech stack is, and you might very well ask the team to look at particular vendors. But some of the things I'll be talking about today are specific to the CISO position. Most of them are, but there will also be ones very much synonymous with where I think security can or should go as well. The first half of this talk is going to be a bit of a rear view mirror. We need to know where we've been in order to talk about the possibilities of where we're going to go to. So bear with me, but I think it'll be a good and helpful review. What I was saying 6 years ago was that essentially we would move into a position of hopefully being more proactive than reactive. I think everyone was interested in whether the CISO could have a seat at the table. That was the big thing. And I think for the most part, these ideas have come to fruition. More and more, we're talking less and less tech. We're talking more and more business language. And I think fundamentally, as security practitioners, it's not that what we do day to day that has fundamentally changed, or that I think will perhaps change, but it is very much the way in which we talk to our peers, to our leadership, to our boards, and as Hoff was talking about in the previous talk, to our customers, and the way in which we are portrayed to the rest of the industry. You have to recall, this is a pretty young practice relative to other practices. Sales has been around for, of course, a very long time, but in terms of modern practice, essentially started 100 years ago. Legal's been around for a very long time, right? Security, in terms of modern and cybersecurity, is a practice essentially, 30 years old or so. And we'll be touching on that here in a bit as well. Want to talk about what we were basically going over 6 years ago, and some of the things that I mentioned in that talk. So I certainly don't want you to waste your time going back and watching it. So what did I say? I highlighted that I thought traditional metrics, things that we focused on years ago, like vulnerabilities and malware metrics, at a board level would probably change. To a great degree, I think it probably has. I was actually just talking to a good CISO friend a few weeks ago, and they were actually talking about how talking about vulnerabilities at the board level has become a trap for them. Because the more and more you talk about a singular topic at the board, the more and more used to that metric or that topic or that problem or level of maturity, whatever the case might be. You want to be consistent with your messaging to the board, and you want to be able to create what I call a Rosetta Stone. If you're talking about vulnerabilities going unpatched or patched, I think their point was fairly true. It can be a difficult place to escape from. And I think that's why we've moved more towards levels of maturity or the typical green, yellow, reds, or standard pictures of NIST, whatever the case might be. The point is that you want to be able to highlight something that is more of a business level view rather than a technical view. And that's difficult to do with vulnerabilities. The big point of my previous talk was a push towards quantification, which is funny since I'm saying that vulnerabilities shouldn't necessarily be the central point there. But frankly, I think the point is that you want to be able to put something in a language that, of course, they can understand. And if you start showing them numbers, and those numbers continue to go up, you can be in a tough place in terms of explaining what that means. The other aspect that I mentioned was that frameworks were not strategy. Frameworks are frameworks for a reason. And that I felt as though we would run into a position of diminishing returns in terms of traditional security frameworks. We'll expound on that more as the talk goes. The other aspect I mentioned was, of course, ROI. The issue is, I think most people think gaining your initial budget and resources can be really difficult. But I think I would posit that gaining additional resources and budget once you reach a level of maturity is actually far more difficult. And so the burden of ROI only increases as the program matures. I think this is some no-brainer stuff that any of us could have mentioned. It was fairly obvious that the old saying, attackers don't break in, they log in. Identity, of course, has become core to so many things, and given the introduction and wide adoption of AI, we can't even trust our own eyes or ears. And so I think identity is really going to become absolutely the central point of security going forward. Another interesting thing, and this has been cyclical for 30 years, right? We go from these, we want to be cutting edge, best of breed, and then all of a sudden we want to manage things in a more central manner, or we want to reduce our vendor load. It's pretty obvious, even back then, that Microsoft, Google's, et cetera, were going to play more and more in the security space. Microsoft has proven that model. Google has seen how much money they've made, is chasing a similar angle of approach. What we didn't know in 2019 that we now know is the incredible rise and then acquisition of Wiz is proof point to this. So certainly we've got more capital and venture capitalists and startups than we can shake a stick at, that's for sure. However, enterprises are increasingly dependent on these kind of platforms, whether that be a Microsoft, a Google, Okta, et cetera. And then the isolation of the CISO role historically, rather than that seat at the table and a member of the team, it very much felt isolated in terms of that position back in 2019. And the other big point I was making, of course, was that more and more business language, metrics, quantitative approach would overcome kind of the historical FUD. Now, y'all, I have built a career on FUD. I love FUD. FUD still works. There's a reason why there is FUD. However, it does change the, let's say, the impact and the how much that is going to connect depending on your audience, right? And it is increasingly difficult to use FUD at an executive or board level. And I think that's the fundamental shift we're seeing. As a practitioner, you've got to know about the FUD. You have to know how the threat landscape changes. You have to know, what the trends are. So I don't think it's ever going to go away, but there just needs to be more tools in our tool belt, so to speak, than the classic FUD. All right, what did pre-2019 look like? If you all recall, there were a zillion studies and numbers thrown about that CISOs were lasting a year and a half to 24 months. It was the greatest executive revolving door, and it was very easy to double check this. You could literally go on LinkedIn and look at the tenures of CISOs versus CMOs, CEOs, CTOs. It was obvious to all of us. The position was a rotating door, and the attitude was, hey, let's just fire the coach, get a new coach in here, see if it changes the dynamic. Well, fundamentally, you still had the same team, whether that was below the CISO or above the CISO, and eventually people figured out, yeah, all right, just firing and rehiring is not necessarily moving us forward. Then we got into the issue of actually, let me mention a few things that were happening there. CEOs were the ones getting fired prior to 2019. You had the Home Depot and Target breaches back in 2013, Sony, Equifax. You had a lot of CEOs that were essentially stepping down due to breach, and that I think was a big signal to the industry. The next dynamic we had was CISOs getting scapegoated or targeted by the SEC. Everyone's familiar with Uber and SolarWinds. We'll touch on those again in a moment. But I think one of the most interesting aspects during that time period was the Drizzly CEO and their breach, because what happened there was the FTC basically dictated that the next job that CEO had, they had to build out a data protection program. That, I think, is absolutely amazing and very, very interesting in terms of the kind of who gets the heat, so to speak, CEO versus CISO. Of course, we've got the Coinbase breach going on currently. Still lots of things to discover with that, but you can see that the CEO is front and center there. So a couple things. One, the CISO position is not turning over like it used to. We're not as disposable, but we're certainly accountable. And the fact that the SEC has targeted CISOs was frankly a huge change for all of us. So let's go through a couple of the moments over the last 5 to 6 years. The SolarWinds breach obviously was a biggie. And then, of course, what none of us could predict was COVID. I would tell you that COVID essentially accelerated a lot of things that were probably going to happen anyway. Certainly our adoption of identity as the, kind of zero trust, center of our universe, with everyone having to work remote. That was a big shift, and really progressed a lot of things from a security perspective that we were all pushing for. The SolarWinds breach occurs. As I mentioned, the fact that both the CEO and the CISO there were targeted was big news. Throughout this period, especially with ransomware going crazy, the cyber insurance game changed quite a bit. When cyber insurance was first introduced, it was viewed as a big moneymaker. Then we get tons and tons of ransomware, and they are having to pay out a ton. Cyber insurance is changed incredibly over the last few years. I want to mention there's been plenty of coverage about Uber and SolarWinds, but I will say, similar to Hoff's talk, it really is important that you share these really difficult journeys and events with the rest of the community. And I applaud everyone that has done so. Joe and Tim have certainly done so across the CISO community. I'm an Austinite, as is Tim, and I can't thank him enough, frankly, for how open and honest he's been about his situation. And I really applaud those guys, regardless of how you feel about those breaches. They've been very open and honest, and I think helpful for everyone else in the industry. It's important that we recognize that, and as Hoff's quote from Dan Geer said, it is insanely important that we share everything we know. Then, of course, the big change was the SEC got very serious about enforcement. And we've got public companies disclosing 8Ks when a material breach occurs. And this has changed the dynamic for the CISO incredibly. So, yeah, there were a lot of obvious things that I think any of us could have predicted back in 2019, but there was a whole hell of a lot that occurred that none of us saw coming. One of the things I want to highlight, you are all familiar with the Verizon DBIR, the Mandiant M-Trends report. They are insanely important. They kind of, are trailing metrics in terms of what is going on the threat landscape and what people are seeing from an incident response standpoint. However, I would tell anyone in a CISO seat, these are not the reports to be centering your universe around. Because there's a big difference between what incident responders see, what vendors see, and what actually ends up in a court of law. And increasingly, a CISO's got to be worried about what is going to appear in a court of law, how they will be held accountable. And these reports have very different metrics as relative to a DBIR or M-Trends report. A few things. Yeah, of course we're seeing litigation all the time, but litigation is changing too. There are so many damn breaches. They're beginning to all look the same. And all of our data has been breached so many times that, any of you that have gone to Have I Been Pwned, I mean, if you've got an email address of any age, I mean, it's on there, whether it was old breaches like Yahoo's or LinkedIn, or whether it's a newer breach, all of our information is out there. Hell, our DNA information is out there at this point. It's unfortunate, but we're kind of used to that, and so are the courts. I bring that up because it really changes the dynamic in terms of the defensive posture. You're not just defending against attackers. You're defending against litigation, and you really have to have your act together if you're going to have any kind of case if something goes to court. It's typical for a CISO to be telling a board, yeah, sure, we've got ransomware risk, we've got phishing risk, but I think the more impactful thing, something that would resonate with a board would be, hey, we've got missteps in our vendor management, we've got, we're not prepared for regulatory disclosure because we're not as quantitative as the expectation might look. And if you go look at any of the 8Ks that have been published, there are people that have looked into this sort of thing. Maybe 40% of them actually really meet what the SEC's after. What the SEC really wants isn't the fact that you're publicly disclosing the breach. That's the way many of us view it. Oh, something happened, it's material, therefore I have to tell everyone. And I'm not just telling my customers, but I'm telling our investors as well. What they're really after is, hey, if you're going to tell something to the investors, you need to tell them whether the breach is going to have an effect on the business long term. And they want something quantitative. And that's the big difference between most of the 8Ks you see, is fundamentally most of them are just highlighting that something happened. They're not really telling you what that impact might be. All right, this is a ridiculous slide, y'all. I'm both embarrassed and incredibly proud of it. I'm a Gen Xer, grew up on Bozo the Clown, so I like buckets. We're humans, we like things in threes. In order for us to understand something new, we generally put it in a bucket of current understanding. So that's where my point of pride comes from. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're essentially a 30-year-old practice, and every single decade of that looks very different from the previous one. Historically, let's call these 1, 2, 3 from left to right. Historically, right, why did most of us get involved in security? It was bucket 3. Prevent getting popped. Like, that's the fundamental point of the job, right? 2006, PCI gets introduced. Things change pretty drastically because now we've got check boxes in a very serious way. Certainly we had audits, and we've got many audits that have come since, but PCI now is 18 years old, y'all. It has been around for quite a long time, and as much as I would have made fun of PCI back in 06, PCI 4 is pretty darn stringent. If you can pass PCI 4, there's already a certain level of maturity already in that program. As we all know as security practitioners, the big question comes down to scope and coverage, not compliance or checkboxes. But so for the longest time, the industry has been focused on those two dynamics, greasing the skids of the business. Can we check the boxes? Can we highlight a level of due diligence? Can we enable the business to sell and do what it needs to do? And in the process, can we also keep us from getting popped and breached? I would say post-COVID, what was the biggest change that I would highlight to you, though? It's what I refer to here as bucket 2. I would posit that the greatest thing that has happened in security is the thing that is perhaps most nightmarish and hated by all of us, is those damn silly questionnaires. However, I think it's good old-fashioned high school peer pressure that is actually lifting the tide and bringing all the ships with it. As consumers, we don't particularly care so much, and I think the amount of times T-Mobile has been breached kind of highlights that, y'all. We keep buying it. They're doing very good against AT&T and Verizon. As consumers, especially American consumers, fairly obvious we don't take our privacy that seriously. Privately, we say we do, but publicly, the trend is pretty plain, right? GDPR is pretty darn stringent, but here in the States, of course, we're still doing it state by state. There's no federal privacy. At the enterprise level, though, it is a much different ballgame. And it's because, of course, during COVID, everyone realized the fundamental truth is the internet is just everybody's network, and that supply chains really matter. And every single citizen on planet Earth figured that out. And so that made all of us far more interested in those supply chains. And because everyone's getting breached all the time, I'm sure many of you have been in this position or thought it. I mean, a good chunk of the incidents we work are not our own incidents anymore. They're third party. That was the whole point of Hoff's talk. If you were a LastPass customer, you had an incident. And it happens all the time. Matter of fact, one of the legal papers that I reference in this talk, 27% of the cases that lawyer agency works are third party. So it's not just us. What incidents are making it to court? The third party ones, because we're increasingly holding each other accountable, and that I would argue is driving better security at the enterprise level than the SEC, the FTC, or the desire to stay out of the news. It's we don't want to get sued, and we've got to have customer trust. I would tell you bucket 2 here is the most important thing in modern day security. I would also highlight to y'all, as Gen Xers, we're getting pretty old. You have to forgive the executives that you work with, right? They came up thinking security was all bucket 3, and then bucket 1, right? So when you're talking to an executive that isn't necessarily security savvy or even tech savvy, you have to understand that their view of security is very much those 2 buckets. Can you check the boxes? Can you keep us out of the news? The way I think a modern CISO can really win is by highlighting bucket 2. If you've got to have a battle/conversation with your engineers or your product managers, You do not want to be talking about bucket 1 or bucket 3, especially bucket 3, because what is bucket 3? FUD. What is bucket 2? Business. And the moment you make your security problems customer problems, the attitude of your executives, your engineers, and your product managers are going to change, and they're going to change very quickly. The point is that we are middle people, the same as product managers, and we need to be explaining to the business that the expectations are not ours. We're not in some dark closet making up the rules of how draconian we're going to be with our policies. We're getting pushed. And I'll tell you where my mind really changed on this was the day I saw an RFI come in from a shoe company that had the same requirements and questions as a financial institution. Right? Financial institutions, as we all know, those are some of the toughest enterprise customers to deal with because the expectations are high. Now we have shoe companies asking the same darn things. And they're not asking how you're preventing and keeping out the attackers anymore. They're asking, what access do your employees have to my data? So yeah, times have changed quite a bit. I wouldn't be a good Austinite if I didn't have a Willie reference. One of my favorite Willie Nelson albums is Phases and Stages. He did this album, I believe, early 80s after a divorce. And we all go through phases and stages, as does security, as does the threat landscape, and certainly the CISO role, as we're talking about today, does as well. So I think we're about to enter a new phase and stage, is my point here. We've kind of gotten to the point of a good chunk of the programs have reached a decent level of maturity. But now the question is, what's next? I used this exact same slide in my 2019 talk. Same slide, probably the same call to action here. Again, I think we are heading in a direction of serious quantification being the primary communication tool. I would argue that increasingly we are going to sound like Edward Norton's character in Fight Club, talking about algorithms and math. You know, how much should we care about a problem? What is the business risk from a quantitative perspective? Can we provide the CFO with the Vegas odds on a decision? All these frameworks are lovely and nice, but as I say here, you know, at some point they become wallpaper. If you're showing the board the same damn NIST imagery or CIS imagery, and you've gotten to a decent level of maturity, what are you doing after that is the question. And that's the question they're asking you. It's no longer about being audited, it's about being challenged by the board as to what you're doing beyond what the historical expectations of the role have been. And I think increasingly, more and more programs are reaching a level of NIST 2.5 to 3, or on a COBIT scale, 3 to 3.5. And then what, y'all? You know, then it's very much a question of ROI, then it's very much a question of attempting to inform the business as to what the risks might be. We're not talking about historical controls as much, we're now talking about decision making. I think one of the aspects of this that the frameworks don't touch on enough is attacker sophistication. We'll touch on that here in a moment. But as I mentioned, I think it's more about helping the company understand its financial and capital allocation. Where should you be spending? How should you be spending? We're going to talk on that more here in a minute. It's kind of like brakes on a race car, right? We all think of race cars as going incredibly fast, but what race cars are incredibly good at is braking. And there's got to be a balance there, and I think that's where the role is headed. All right, a little background here. 2013. We all know Henry Ford introduces the line here, the assembly line, which allows us to build at an incredible pace and gain consistency. Since then, we've had ideas like Six Sigma, Kaizen, Toyota Way, right? We are really good at building stuff as humans at this point, and we know how to control our quality. And I think increasingly, security isn't about stopping a breach or locking things down, but especially with something like AppSec, It's very much a game of quality. If you look at the last few years of what CISA has been saying and pushing, it's very much about the developmental process and whether we can get to a better level of quality, and security is frankly just a component of that. What was our big assembly line revolution? 2013, literally 100 years later, the Phoenix Project comes out. I talked about this book 6 years ago. I'll probably be talking about this book 5 years from now. If you haven't read it, I would highly suggest doing so. This book covers the DevOps revolution. It essentially highlights what our modern day assembly line of software looks like. All right, and you think, well, where does security come into play here? Well, think of infrastructure as code. Think of our SaaS tools. Think of SCA. Think of our the way in which we're deploying code and infrastructure these days. Right, we moved beyond the pet analogy of our servers and operations towards the cattle mentality, right? Everything comes up and goes down very quickly. So we're not securing things necessarily after the fact, meaning the old saying of security was always bolt on, right? We came up with new infrastructure, then we bolted something on. Now you have to truly have security baked into the process. That's what shift left is all about. Shift left just means security has got to catch up with the DevOps process. It is why we're security people, we like to get hung up on semantics, but it's why I do not like the term DevSecOps. You don't need sec in the middle of DevOps. If you're doing DevOps correctly, security is baked in. There's no need to call it out separately. That's my argument. We've all got opinions. All right, what changed the automobile, though? In 1965, Ralph Nader comes out with a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. This analogy has been used before. That book was FUD. He ruined a perfectly, what I would say, beautiful car in the Chevrolet Corvair. You can see that this book was marked down from $6 to $1. I would say good reason for that. But y'all, again, FUD did its job. It didn't matter whether Nader was wrong or right. It mattered that he was plastered all over the TV and got to testify in front of Congress. That's what mattered. The question for us is it going to be an unsafe at any speed moment, or are we going to have, these silliest FUD predictions of, a cyber Pearl Harbor, cyber 9/11, right? We've all seen them. Who knows? More than likely, it's an era, right? This is why talking about this every 5 years makes good sense. What could change this and make it go very, very quickly? A real war. I think if you actually saw a real war, well, let's take the obvious, US-China kind of dynamic, you're going to see CISA not get defunded, but refunded very quickly. And the change from speed to safety would go pretty darn fast, I think, in terms of the companies we work for and operate. This all remains to be seen. I imagine, hopefully, of course, that doesn't happen, and this becomes an era where we adopt these things slowly over time. Let's talk about reporting dynamics for a moment. This is a very popular debate and discussion. What I would tell you, the reporting structure doesn't matter quite as much as we want it to. A lot of this comes down to company culture, company dynamics, company politic, executive capability. There is no right or wrong answer. There's no answer these 5 questions and here's where you should be. Right? If the reporting structure of the CISO is currently working, there's an argument for, hey, don't mess with what's working. Don't fix what's not broken. However, post breach, what has historically happened? Yeah, the reporting structure of the CISO changes. At least half the time, if not 3/4 of the time post-breach. Historically, CISO reported to the CIO. That has been changing quite a bit. And post-breach, like I said, very good chance that the CIO is not going to be who the CISO is reporting to any longer. CTO has also been a very popular position. What I would tell you all is, if the program is still working on foundational levels, that's absolutely where the CISO and the security program should be, right? If you're still building out your DevOps lifecycle, then you need to be attached to the architecture and to the technical aspect. If you're a platform, a SaaS company, you need to get the DevOps piece right. If you've reached a decent level of maturity, and the board is now challenging you not on checkboxes, but maturity, ROI, bang for the buck. If you're now working on what the risk appetite of the company is, and really trying to match the security program for the level of insurance, let's call it, internal insurance, then things have been changing quite a bit. You're now seeing CISOs report directly to the board, which I think is the end game. We'll touch more on that here in a moment. The CIO, the general counsel, or the CFO. They can all work, and they can all work for very different reasons. Fundamentally, though, what we're here to do, like the race car analogy, is to ensure that we've got good guardrails for the business, and that we're measuring things the same way the other functions of the company are measured. The way, sales and development are probably two of the most, measured functions of a company. And increasingly, security will be, I think, looked at that way. So the question becomes not necessarily is there a right or wrong spot in terms of structure and reporting, but where should you be reporting for a given company, a particular set of executives and culture, and for the level of maturity or perceived immaturity that the program might be in. Where do I think we want to attempt to go? And why am I talking to you all about this? Because a lot of this is industry trends. There's a reason why that reporting structure is covered so much in trend reports and discussed so widely. In the end, and I don't know whether this will be 2030, probably not, but where do I think we should be pushing for? Show of hands, how many of you work for public companies? Pretty good chunk, almost half. You might be familiar with the internal audit function, or IA, and for those that aren't, the most reviewed and scrutinized aspect of any public company for sure, and most companies, is the financials. Internal audit is responsible for that. They generally have direct ties to the CEO, the CFO, and generally report to the audit committee. As we mature, I think we've got to push cybersecurity in a direction of digital safety. Again, people have talked about this before, but y'all, it's the way in which we look at ourselves and the way in which we talk about ourselves and our practice to the rest of the industry, to the rest of the executive team, and to the board. So a lot of this isn't necessarily a change in what any of us are going to be doing beyond the quantitative aspect and the documentation aspect. Most of this is going to be communication and how we are perceived amongst our peers and viewed within the industry, right? We're not the ones actually, a CISO doesn't practice security. A CISO measures and communicates risk. I don't patch anything, I don't write code, I don't deploy infrastructure, I don't process invoices. The company does that. It is their security program. They're the security people. We are the ones that are essentially pushing the company towards higher levels of quality. Again, the DevOps process is what we need to be integrating ourselves into. Once you do that, then all of this becomes more of a math, and I think Edward Norton and Fight Club kind of insurance game. The way in which we are going to build credibility is to be able to highlight and communicate these aspects. All right. Again, let's talk about perception. Security, just like software development itself, is an OpEx issue, right? If you look at a public company's three primary documents, the balance sheet, the income statement, and the cash flow statement, we're all represented on the income statement as a part of OpEx. Especially in SaaS-heavy orgs, that's absolutely true. Now, the longer you go without a breach, my argument here is that we potentially build up on the balance sheet in the way of really the credibility of the company, right? Your brand. your level of trust, right? We all have in our mind particular opinions about various companies. You probably feel very differently, and this is going back in time, y'all. You probably feel very differently about the Target breach versus the Equifax breach, right? You're going to feel different emotions about different breaches, and this was a really good topic that Hoff covered earlier this morning. It's important to understand how you're viewing these companies, and I think my argument here is that the longer a company goes without a breach, the more you are adding to the trust and the more brand power you are adding to the company. If you can build up that idea, then I think you're increasingly viewed at least partially on the balance sheet rather than just purely the income statement. Meaning, how do we transform ourselves to just a big fat cost center? You've got to show the ROI, and if there's any kind of track record there, you can highlight that. Now, you can't challenge hackers, and you can't say you're invincible, because we all know that's not the case. But I think this is a way in which you can talk about it with a CFO. All right, attacker sophistication. I want to touch on this real quick. What can you do right now? If you've got a program that's fundamentally built around CIS or NIST, what can you add to it to start pushing this direction? And many programs do this. I think a very easy thing, just pull up sticks. This was formed years and years ago for threat intel sharing. You can see I've got a classic COBIT scoring here, but you can do this however you like. The point is, the population of planet Earth on the bottom is really big. If your controls can't stop, a huge population of people just clicking on things or scanning, then you're in a rough spot. This is a very good way to look at your control maturity, not from a checkbox perspective, but from a real-world perspective. This is really what pen testing in a modern-day sense is good for. Proving how high your sandbags are actually stacked for a real-world flood. This is a gigantic wall of text, y'all. But I'll leave it here in case you want to chase this idea. This is my explanation to my board as to why I feel as though attacker sophistication is very important and something that has to be talked about at an exec and board level. The question is, it's not who you're up against in terms of nation states or, the individual or individuals behind a given attack. The question is, what sophistication is your business likely going to be up against? That's the question. And again, how much have you tested those controls in that sandbag analogy so you can say, hey, I think we can essentially defend ourselves at a given level. That's what we want to be able to highlight. All right, how many of you have heard of the dark forest hypothesis now being proven as a theory? Essentially half the internet is junk. We all are well aware that the internet is primarily a gigantic scam at this point. The good news is it might end up being the death of social media because, why are we all on Slack or Discord? Why are we all here and present actually talking to real human beings? Because we're fed up with damn robots and bots constantly talking. Let's look at Facebook, Twitter. I refuse to call it anything else. Instagram might be the worst. The internet is nothing but bots at this point. And I think that's going to hopefully cause us to become more human in a sea of AI. But my point here is that everything I just highlighted in terms of the DevOps process and where we're heading is about to speed up drastically. So everything we've been working on in terms of getting security baked in and getting that quality, building our security processes towards that Toyota way of thinking is about to, the heat is on, y'all. The pressure is about to be here in a very serious way. All of us are getting beaten over the head with AI, and there's aspects of that that are absolutely amazing and awesome. What can we do about it right now? What can a CISO do that's similar to the other executive positions? Save money and reduce risk, right? We are looked at as a bonfire of money historically. You can allow your employees to do all sorts of things, right? This is software. But you also have to have a bunch of controls and a bunch of people managing those controls and monitoring those controls. Or you can just save a whole lot of time, money, and reduce risk by changing your policy. right? Hoff's talk earlier, why did that breach happen? BYOD. If you're still allowing BYOD, I don't know why. I really don't. Is it the loveliest thing to do to not be able to check your email from your sister-in-law's laptop at vacation? Whatever, you know. It's just not worth it. Fundamentally, you have got to know who the person is that's logging on, what device they're on, and what network they're on. It's got to be your network, it's got to be your device, and you have got to be able to verify who that human is. If you don't think that way, get ready for the robots, because I don't know how you're going to be able to tell them from the humans. My point here is that policy is about to get a whole lot more serious. We're not going to be talking about technology as much as what we're going to be talking about in terms of policy. What can our humans do? What can our robots do? What can they access? What permissions do they have? All the classic stuff, y'all. It's just that all the scale that is coming for us is intense. One last piece here. I mentioned earlier, 27% of breaches now involve vendors. Your third-party program, even if you hate it, even if you question the value, is probably one of the most important things of your security program, and it's about to get more important due to AI. We all know about browser extensions. We all know about app stores. This is something we've got to watch out for. Really quickly, I want to talk about the security practice in terms of AI. If you're not using a quantitative approach, you don't necessarily have to have expensive software. You can absolutely use the robot. There's some really good investments happening at the VC level. There's companies like One CISO, a disclaimer, I'm an advisor of theirs, that are chasing this idea of full stack CISO. So it's certainly happening, and our ability to check our own homework and the board's ability to check what we're telling them is going to happen. All right, I'm going to fast forward here past the awesome Star Trek analogy of essentially we're Worf from the TNG going towards Worf of DS9 and move right towards the statement of we don't ship dashboards, y'all, we ship decisions. All right, references for everything I've talked about here. Any questions?
STFU.
Yep. Questions, Jake?
We're done.
We're done. Thanks, y'all.